Great. So I'd like to transition us to our panel discussion. Today, we have an awesome lineup of panelists from industry and academia and thought leaders and authors in the data space. So I'd like to start with brief introductions from everyone.
First, awesome. Thanks, Love, for having me. My name is Mara. I run the data science team at Patreon. If you don't know, Patreon's a platform for creators to get paid via recurring membership. We have a data science team of 7 data scientists, 1 ML engineer, and 1 data engineer. And our org is about 240 people or so, mostly working with payments data, but a lot of behavioral analytics data as well. And we're a AWS shop. So we use Redshift. We are migrating to Airflow right now. We also use Amplitude and Avo, which is a really cool tool for instrumentation that's pretty new. And then Tableau, Mode, and Databricks on kind of the statistical analysis and dashboarding side.
Cool. Tobias?
Sure. So I'm Tobias Macy. I run the data engineering podcast, and I've actually had episodes about DBT and Amundsen on the show before. So another way to get some more context on those tools. Mark, who was actually on the show before, so hi. I run the data engineering team, I run the data team and the operations team for a department at MIT called Open Learning. So I'm responsible for a lot of the cloud automation stuff there, and am actively building out the data platform, which has sort of grown ad hoc. So there are a lot of different silos across different business units, and trying to build out stuff to sort of coalesce all of that. Currently focusing on Dagster as the first implementation as our ETL platform, and looking to use things like Pulsar for some of our streaming data and building a data lake, making some use of Dremio for right now, taking a look at Presto as an alternative to that down the road. So yeah, if anybody's interested in learning more about any of that, everything I do at work is open source. So feel free to check us out at github.com/mitodl.
Thank you. Mark?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Grover. I'm a product manager at Lyft in the data team. I'm also one of the creators of the Amundsen project that was talked about. And in the past life, I worked on what Sam called old school technologies in the Hadoop space. At Lyft, we use Amundsen obviously for data discovery. We have some custom tools for doing ETL development. We don't use DBT or anything like that. And then for analytics, we use tools of the nature of Mode. And then we have some use of Apache Superset in there too.
Great, thank you, Mark. Tsvetan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tsvetan. I lead the product analytics team at Thumbtack, which is a team of about 20 or so people. We actually consume data, and our job is to turn it into insights and into better products. So that's why data quality is super important to us. We have all of our data on BigQuery.
Cool. And Michael?
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Kaminsky, based out of Mexico City. I do a bunch of things right now. I'm an entrepreneur working on a number of different products, some of them more related to data than others. I use a lot of different technologies. I've been using DBT for a very long time. Very familiar with BigQuery and Redshift. Right now, I'm actually spending most of my time working in R, both on like proprietary stuff as well as doing a fair amount of open source work, trying to help build out the R and AWS integration ecosystem.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So I'd like to kick off with one of the questions that was upvoted on our question panel. And by the way, thanks to all attendees who voted for questions or submitted the questions. And I think the important one to start with is everyone is talking about data quality and about the tools and about the importance of it, but how do we actually think about setting the goals there and the KPIs and measuring it? So you can't really measure, well, you can't really improve what you can't measure. So how do you formulate the goals for your teams, and how do you know that you're making progress? And here I'm really curious to hear from our guests from the industry. So Mora, Tsvetan, Mark, who are leading data teams. Really curious to hear what do you think about KPIs?
Yeah, I can kick us off here. This question actually got me thinking because we don't have formal KPIs, and we probably will have KPIs soon. The way I think about this is that there's this one moment in our consumption of data that is very obvious to everyone where things have gone wrong, and that's when you have some kind of a data incident, and you have to restate the data. You have to go back and tell people, hey, what I told you yesterday is actually not completely true. You have to kind of change your understanding a little bit. That is not okay in our world, and that to me is a very good sign that something upstream or up in our pipeline is not working well. And so we kind of keep an eye on these things. You know, you could apply kind of the same post-mortem culture that we have for the rest of our engineering efforts. You could kind of log these incidents and count them on a weekly and monthly basis. Unfortunately, I'm actually curious to hear from the other panelists, but you know, we have these things probably at least once a week, and they're of various severity. So you obviously don't want to take everything with you know, the same level of seriousness. You know, if a certified table doesn't refresh, that's kind of a big deal. If a tracking event from an old version of the iOS app stops firing, that's probably a lot less severe. So you kind of want to weigh these things a little bit more. But yeah, I'd say first thing is incidents. The second thing is so one of the presenters talked about certification. I think kind of this notion of coming up with a ratio that tells you how much of the data that's consumed comes from certified sources sounds very appealing. We have something similar to that, but it's not kind of as specific as a ratio. We kind of keep track of, you know, all data versus certified data that has SLAs, and you know, people maintain and build these tables every day on the analytics or on the data engineering team. So I just leave it at those two things for now.
Yeah, we similarly at Patreon use this idea of coverage. And I think one of the important things we try to do is we try to rank the priority of relevant data sets. So we have like a set of core tables, and we try to understand what coverage do we have there for documentation and for quality checks. And I think your coverage kind of standards and KPIs can differ based on how important that data is to your organization, to your metrics. The other thing we started just to do very recently, which I'm super excited about, is we're using Avo for behavioral analytics. So all the instrumentation in the app we send through Avo, which is a pretty new tool for instrumentation. And they have some automated quality metrics as well that tell you how many issues you have in your analytics tracking. So for example, like maybe an event property is camel cased instead of snake cased, or maybe like something, the name changed from day to day, and they actually will aggregate those issues and you can see them over time. So we've started to use that as well, and we'll have KPIs there around reducing the number of issues that we have in our Avo app, which is at least a good start for us on the kind of behavioral analytics instrumentation side.
Great.
I have something to add to that, or maybe like pose a further question. Back when I was running the analytics team at Harry's, which is an e-commerce company, I struggled with this idea of KPIs a lot. And one of the things that I struggled with is that for me, it was really easy to come up with KPIs that were sort of, you know, programmatic in things you can measure, right? Like documentation coverage, right? And I thought that made a lot of sense. But my problem was that I also see the role of the data team as also being like an R&D team, right? And so my worry was that our KPIs would focus us on doing a lot of infrastructure and a lot of maintenance, but not doing a lot of like research and development, which is where I think that actually most of the value of a data team comes from. And so my problem with KPIs was like, if we focus on the KPIs, we're going to ignore this other stuff that's really important, but that's harder to measure. And so it's like the, you know, the man searching for his keys under the spotlight, right? Rather than focusing on the things that are most important. I'm curious how the rest of the panelists think about that problem.
Michael, I have a question for you. So in your definition of the data team, what is the scope? Does it include the platform as well as the analysts and the scientists, or just the platform?
That's a great question. For me, at least my experience is mostly working with startups. We're working with, you know, very small teams, right? So teams of like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 people. And generally that team covers all of those things. So it's data science, analytics and BI, analytics engineering, and platform.
And it
So
also
maybe that's why this question doesn't make sense to everyone.
Right. And it also sounded to me, you buy the notion of KPIs for perhaps the platform or the infrastructure pieces, but it's more of the analysis and the science pieces which are like on your mind, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Hey, I'm not going to answer that one. I'll let other people answer that one. I was just clarifying.
I was going to say, this is one of my favorite questions of like, why are data teams so hard to measure if data teams are doing all the measurement? I've definitely talked to data leaders that have KPIs like the number of insights published per week or month. I personally think that creates the wrong incentives for analysis and research. Like it's going to make my team want to just like come up with some easy facts and publish those out and say that that's an insight. I think for me, it comes down to like how much of an issue is your data quality that you need to focus on that as a priority versus the other things your team is trying to drive, whether that's R&D or insights or impact for the business. And for us, I think a lot about this like toil factor is how much are your data scientists toiling, looking for the data, trying to figure out what this column means. That factor can only be so high until you start to have data scientists and analysts that are angry and upset and like hate their life because that's what they're doing all day. So as a data team, you have to think about like how much do we need to reduce the toil factor versus all the other things that we're trying to drive as an organization. And that I think is best measured by asking people like, how much are you toiling and how dirty is the data, just like heuristically, rather than an actual number.
Makes sense. I'm curious to hear also what Mark thinks about the KPIs, because I know that that's been a big focus for your team, Mark.
Yeah, so perhaps switching back to the data quality KPIs, and I think there are metrics here that we had considered. I think some of this is specific to your organization as well, but in the organizations I have seen, data quality issues don't always show up as incidents. That means that we couldn't use incidents or as a metric to bring down necessarily. Plus incidents are also like a variety of different other reasons that can cause them. So we had to come back to using a metric that I think was more intrinsic, and it's lined with what Maura was talking earlier, which was coverage. So for us, that is number of tests, and the platform team produces a primitive, that of a test that folks can employ, and then we measure that coverage or the number of tests. Now, in my opinion, metrics, there are two really important metrics when it comes to any product. It's adoption and it's satisfaction. So like number of tests will give us some proxy for adoption. And then satisfaction is usually around the experience of creating a test or the experience of debugging a test. And for that, we run a qualitative survey to talk to the owners who are actually setting those tests up.
Great, thank you. So actually the most upvoted question that we got for today was, can we leverage ML to do the data quality analysis? Do we actually have to put all the tests and be satisfied or not satisfied with the experience of writing those tests, or can we actually leverage some automation and help the machine tell us whether the data is right or wrong? So I'm curious if anyone had thoughts on this and what works and what doesn't when it comes to automation.
So I don't have any direct experience with this, but one thing I will say is to caution against the garbage in, garbage out principle, where if you're using bad data to train a machine learning model to recognize bad data, then you're potentially going to be shooting yourself in both feet. So I think that there is some potential for value there if you have a sort of general sense of what your data quality is and a good baseline to start from, and then do anomaly detection to say, okay, this is something that is an outlier from the rest of the data that I'm working with. But if you don't already have that baseline set, then I think it could probably be fairly difficult to be able to build a useful model to highlight useful anomalies or errors in the data that you're working with to be able to drive up quality.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The way I interpreted that question was that there are two options. One option is that there is an ML algorithm who's like actually putting some tests on your data. And then the other option is that there's humans who are actually curating and putting tests on the data. And I actually disagree that it's a versus premise. I actually think it's an and premise. We have to do both. And we actually, I think, in my opinion, the key here is to figure out a good constructive way to get the human in the loop of the algorithm. And the key reason I think that is because I think not all data is created equally, right? Often we see in organizations that 20% of the data sets lead to 80% of the queries. Even within a data set, you will find certain columns are actually much more useful than others, right? So the first pass, I think it always makes sense to have a human put tests on those columns that we know are impactful to the organization. And then as we work on algorithms to put tests, I don't think it makes sense to do like a boil the ocean kind of approach, but instead it's very important to use the usage metrics to actually power which tests are going to be put on what columns. And it's always important to actually get the approval process from the owner, because I know I would raise my hand. I would love to hear who else has been here, like getting pinged by a robot who put some test somewhere and it's just like thinks it's anomalous, right? And it's actually not. It's appropriate for the data set in question.
Yeah, and that brings in the other useful element of data quality is just having the domain expertise of understanding within the data set itself, what are the expectations of what normal looks like and what is the overall context in which this data is being produced and consumed in order to ensure that you're putting useful tests and useful checks on the data as it's being propagated through those different systems.
Yeah. Another interesting question that I think bugs many of people who are here today, and actually was upvoted, is so we've been focusing on creation of data and creation of analysis and growing our team, and so we ended up with hundreds of tables, thousands of reports in Mode, Looker, whatever the BI tool, and zero tests and zero processes. And how do we start? What can we do right now, given that ML is probably hard to implement right off the bat, and manual checks may be a long way to go. So
well, the biggest thing is to just start somewhere. The useful heuristic there is, what is the thing that is causing me the most pain right now? Because that's likely something that's going to be causing other people pain. And as soon as you address that, then it gives you the space to be able to confidently move on to the next thing. And so you can get this ratcheting effect of, right now everything is painful, but as soon as you start taking one step in the right direction, then every other step is going to be successively less painful until you get to a point where you actually do have some measure of quality in your data sets and some confidence in how things are being tested and vetted. Whereas if you just continue to let yourself sort of feel the pain and feel defeated, then you're never going to make that progress.
Yeah, I'll tack onto that. And I'd say that, like, for me, there's sort of two things to do. One is triage, right? Which I think is what Tobias was basically saying. Like, as things are coming in and people are complaining about it, like, figure out, come up with some level of importance and then just use that to sort things. And the second is cleanup, which is like in the situation that you're talking about where there's like thousands of reports and thousands of tables. I think someone already said, most of those are probably generating no value. Anytime that I've encountered that situation, like most of them, no one's looking at. You go talk to the owner and they're like, oh, I don't look at that anymore. I know it's broken. And so like going through that process of cleanup and just like getting rid of stuff that is infrequently used or not used at all will make the problem seem a lot more manageable. I don't think there's that many organizations that have this huge sprawling thing and then like no idea where to start. It's probably that there's like 10 things that people look at and like that's the important stuff anyway.
Yeah, on that point of cleanup, I think it's immensely important, and it's also one of those things that people don't usually consider sexy and appealing to do. My kind of preferred approach is to kind of embed this into the culture of the team and create the right rewards and recognition for people who do the grunt work. One kind of extreme example is, the next, for those of you who are leading teams, at the next performance cycle, incorporate something like, has this person helped us clean our data in their promotion announcement. I'm not saying they should be promoted because just that, but in their promotion announcement, put a spotlight on their work around cleaning data, around making everything easier for everyone. And that's going to create a flywheel internally and kind of help that create that culture. But otherwise, it's really hard to get, people to believe that this is important work for everyone in the whole team.
The other thing I'd recommend in that vein is sometimes you just need to swarm on it. Like sometimes you need 2 full days, and if you were in an office, order pizza and beer and soda and like get everyone just heads down doing it. I think that if you try to do it like 20 minutes, between analyses over a year, it sometimes is not as effective. That's definitely something we've done, is like have these swarms. And then the other thing I'd say to this question is like, make sure that the new data you're creating has some sort of curation or documentation built into the process, so that you don't do this big cleanup and then you realize you've created all these new data sets that still have the same problem. Like make sure looking forward that you're kind of solving the problem as well.
Yeah, and tacking on to the end of that, one of the things that's bitten me a number of times is walking into a situation where there was the implicit understanding that the data retention policy was infinity. And so to the point of making sure that you have some policy in place as you start making those improvements, that anytime new data sets get created, you have something to say, this is what the life cycle of that data looks like, and this is what the retention policy is, where you don't necessarily have to apply it in a blanket way, but have something so that when somebody creates a data set, they understand that there is going to be some period where you're going to come asking and saying, do I need this? Do we need this anymore? Can I delete it now because it's causing pain and confusion for other people who are accessing it when it's no longer valid?
Yeah. We have time for one more question, and I'd like to double click on the point of ownership of data. So how do you solve it for the ownership in terms of the culture and the processes and incentives, like what Tsvetan has brought up? So does every asset in your organization, data asset, dashboard, report, table, has an owner? Does it have to have an owner?
In our case, we do. We have multiple owners, so that if one of them is on vacation, another one can pick up things if there's an incident. And owners get emails when the table changes, when there's some failure in the loading process. So yeah, I think you need to have owners.
I would agree with that in principle, but I think in practice, I have found that hard to work. For me, it's been identifying the top 20% of the data assets that provide 80% of the value, and just hitting those 20%. And I mostly end up ignoring the rest 80%.
That's a great point, actually. We do have owners for the most used tables, not for everything. Good point.
Yeah, at Patreon, we're not quite at a place yet where everyone has owners. I wish we were. I think the most frequently asked question is probably who owns this. But one of the things I've been trying to do is I think at the end of the day, ownership is like a people problem or a people challenge. And so finding the people that are like obsessed with data quality, obsessed with cleanup, obsessed with owning, and putting them in the right roles and putting them in the right space. And then I also think from a culture perspective, there's a lot you can do. At Patreon, we have the data science seal of approval, which is like a literal emoji and a phrase that people use when something is data approved. And so if there are ways you can make data cleanup and ownership fun or gamified, or give people points or badges, that can actually surprisingly work pretty well and going a long way for improving data quality.
Great.
And well, just to tack onto that, one other thing an interesting conversation that I had is the idea of treating data as a product that gets produced by and for different teams within an organization. So rather than just having everything be the responsibility of the data team, have it be the responsibility of whoever is actually creating that information to treat it as a product and ensure that it is being produced in a clean fashion, and so that you have a way of tying it back to whoever is actually producing that data and making them be the sort of ultimate owner of it. But just having that idea of the data mesh is the terminology that was used in the conversation I had, but treating data as a product that is consumed by different teams and sort of creating the ownership in that regard, rather than having everything be the responsibility of a smaller group of people.
Cool. Well, it's been an awesome panel. Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks so much for the speakers who put the time to share their great best practices and accomplishments with the community. This is just a slide to shout out the tools that were mentioned today. We'll also send some information on them and also how to contact the teams if you are interested. And please stay tuned for the future events. We'll definitely hold more of those and answer more questions and go in depth on some of the topics that everyone highlighted as interesting. Thanks, everyone, and till next time.